Staff Sergeant Marcus Reilly crouched in a frozen foxhole, listening to German tanks rumble through the forest. The Battle of the Bulge had turned the Ardennes into a frozen hell. American units were surrounded, outnumbered, and running low on everything. Food, ammunition, hope. Reilly's squad had been cut off for 3 days. They'd lost half their men. The survivors were down to their last magazines. When German infantry finally charged their position, Reilly stood up with a weapon nobody had ever seen before. It looked like someone had welded 2 Thompson submachine guns together. Twin barrels, twin magazines. A monster of steel and wood that weighed almost 20 pounds. The first German soldier saw it and froze. He'd never seen anything like it. He never would again. Reilly squeezed the trigger and the forest exploded. 40 rounds per second screamed from those twin barrels. The first wave of German infantry simply ceased to exist. Bodies crumpled. Men dove for cover. The advance collapsed in seconds. When the smoke cleared, Reilly was standing in a circle of brass casings, his makeshift weapon smoking from both barrels. The Germans who survived would later tell their commanders about the American with the double gun. They called it Doppeltod, double death, and it wasn't supposed to exist. To understand what Reilly had created, you need to understand what the Thompson was and what it wasn't. The Thompson submachine gun was already legendary by World War II. Designed by General John T. Thompson in 1919, it was originally meant for trench warfare. But the First World War ended before it could be deployed. Instead, the Thompson found fame in the hands of gangsters, bank robbers, and Prohibition-era criminals. The Tommy gun became the symbol of American organized crime. Al Capone's men used them. Bonnie and Clyde used them. Every Hollywood gangster movie featured their distinctive drum magazines, and when World War II began, the U.S. military adopted the Thompson as its primary submachine gun. It was devastating in close combat. The Thompson fired .45 ACP rounds, the same heavy bullets used in the M1911 pistol. Each round hit like a sledgehammer. At close range, a burst from a Thompson could punch through walls, doors, and bodies with terrifying efficiency. The standard M1A1 Thompson had a cyclic rate of about 700 rounds per minute. It used 20 or 30-round stick magazines. In the hands of a trained soldier, it could clear a room faster than any other infantry weapon. But it had limitations. The recoil was substantial. The .45 ACP round kicked hard, and sustained fire required significant strength to control. The effective range was limited, beyond 50 yards. Accuracy dropped dramatically, and for soldiers facing overwhelming numbers, which happened constantly in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, even 700 rounds per minute sometimes wasn't enough. Some soldiers looked at their Thompsons and wondered, what if there was more? Marcus Reilly was a machinist before the war. He'd spent 10 years in a Detroit auto factory, learning to weld, fabricate, and jury-rig solutions to mechanical problems. When something broke on the assembly line, Reilly fixed it. When engineers said something couldn't be done, Reilly did it anyway. The Army put him in an infantry squad. It was a waste of his talents. But it also gave him access to something most machinists never touched: weapons. Reilly started modifying guns the moment he landed in North Africa. Small things at first: improved sights, better grips, modifications that made weapons more comfortable, more accurate, more deadly. By the time his unit reached Italy, Reilly had developed a reputation. Men brought him broken weapons and walked away with guns that worked better than factory spec. Anzio Reilly's squad was nearly overrun by a German counterattack. They were outnumbered 5-1. The fighting was so close that men were using rifles as clubs. Reilly survived because he got lucky. A jam in a German rifle gave him the split second he needed to fire first. That night, sitting in his foxhole surrounded by the dead, Reilly had a thought. What if he didn't have to reload? What if he had twice the firepower? What if he could put enough lead in the air to stop any charge, no matter how overwhelming? He found a second Thompson from a dead soldier. He acquired welding equipment from an engineering unit, traded a bottle of whiskey for an hour with their torch, and he started building. Building a twin-barreled Thompson was theoretically simple. Actually, building one was a nightmare. The first problem was alignment. The two barrels had to be perfectly parallel. Even a tiny deviation would cause the rounds to diverge wildly, making the weapon useless beyond a few yards. Reilly solved this by fabricating a custom frame that locked both receivers together with precision that would have impressed the original designers. He used scrap metal from destroyed vehicles, heating and bending it until it fit exactly right. The second problem was the trigger mechanism. A standard Thompson had one trigger and one sear. Now Reilly needed to fire two weapons simultaneously. He spent 3 nights designing a linkage system, a mechanical connection that would pull both triggers at the exact same moment. The parts were hand-filed from raw steel. Each component had to be tested dozens of times. The third problem was weight. A standard Thompson weighed about 10.8 pounds loaded. Reilly's creation weighed nearly 20 pounds. Carrying it was exhausting. Firing it was like wrestling a jackhammer, but the weight also absorbed recoil. When Reilly test-fired the weapon for the first time, he expected the twin barrels to climb uncontrollably toward the sky. Instead, the mass of the doubled frame held the weapon surprisingly steady. The recoil from each barrel partially canceled the other. The muzzle rise was actually less severe than a single Thompson fired rapidly. It wasn't balanced. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't anything an engineer would approve. But it worked. 40 rounds from twin 20-round magazines delivered in less than 2 seconds. Reilly had created a handheld bullet hose. Here's what the military manuals never accounted for. War creates innovation through desperation. When you're surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of options, you don't care about regulations. You don't care about specifications, you care about survival. Reilly's double Thompson was never approved. It was never tested by ordnance. It existed because one man refused to accept the limits of standard-issue equipment. And in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, that refusal would save lives. December 16, 1944, the German Army launched its The German Army. Last great offensive of the war. 3 armies, 400,000 soldiers, 1,400 tanks. They smashed through American lines in the Ardennes forest, creating a massive bulge in the Allied front. American units were surrounded and isolated within hours. The 101st Airborne was trapped at Bastogne. Dozens of smaller units were cut off throughout the forest. Reilly's company was one of them. They'd been advancing through the woods when the German attack cut off their supply lines. Within a day, they were surrounded. Within 2 days, they were running low on ammunition. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero. Men froze to death in their foxholes. The wounded died because medics had no supplies. Every hour brought more German probing attacks, testing their lines for weaknesses. Reilly kept his double Thompson loaded and ready. He had 4 magazines, 80 rounds total. Not much for a standard firefight, but with his weapon, 80 rounds could be delivered in 4 seconds. Untold, December 19th, the Germans found their weakness. A company of Wehrmacht infantry supported by a Panzer IV tank pushed through a gap in the American perimeter. They were aiming for the command post where the wounded were being treated. Reilly's squad was in their path. 12 American soldiers against 40 Germans with armor support. The tank came first, grinding through the frozen trees. Its machine gun raked the American positions. 2 men died in the first burst. Then the infantry advanced behind it, using the tank as cover. Standard doctrine said to fall back, find better cover, call for support that wasn't coming. Reilly had a different idea. He waited until the German infantry was close, 30 yards, maybe less, close enough to see the frost on their helmets, close enough to hear them breathing. Then he stood up. The twin Thompsons roared. The sound was unlike anything the soldiers on either side had heard. Not the rat-tat-tat of a single submachine gun. More like a continuous thunderclap that shattered the forest silence. Reilly had practiced with the weapon for months. He knew exactly how to brace it. He knew exactly how long he could hold the trigger before the magazines ran dry. 1.8 seconds. In that time, 40-45 caliber rounds tore through the German advance. The first wave of infantry simply collapsed. Men fell in groups, cut down before they could react. The soldiers behind them dove for cover, unable to process what was happening. The tank commander, buttoned up in his Panzer, couldn't see the source of the carnage. He traversed his turret looking for the machine gun nest that must be responsible. There was no machine gun nest. Just one man with an impossible weapon. Reilly dropped behind cover and reloaded. Both magazines out. Both magazines in. 2 seconds for each hand, moving in practiced unison. He rose again. Another 1.8-second burst. The Germans who had started to recover were caught in the open. Again, more bodies fell. The advance stopped completely. The surviving Germans weren't retreating. They were fleeing, running back toward their own lines, leaving their dead behind. The tank commander, realizing his infantry support had evaporated, reversed his Panzer back into the trees. He wanted no part of whatever had just massacred his soldiers. Reilly stood in his position, steam rising from the twin barrels, surrounded by brass casings that littered the snow like golden rain. 12 Americans, 40 Germans. When the shooting stopped, over 20 German soldiers lay dead in the snow. The rest had run. The American casualties? 2 dead from the initial tank fire, none from the infantry assault, because the infantry assault never reached them. Word of the engagement reached German intelligence within days. Survivors from the shattered infantry company described the weapon, a double-barreled American submachine gun that fired faster than anything they'd ever encountered. German officers were skeptical. Double-barreled firearms existed, shotguns mostly, but a double submachine gun? It seemed like battlefield exaggeration, the kind of tall tale that soldiers tell to explain unexpected defeats. But then more reports came in. Other American units had apparently modified their weapons in similar ways. Or perhaps they were describing the same weapon as it moved from position to position. The Germans couldn't tell. What they knew was that somewhere in the Ardennes, an American soldier, maybe soldier, was carrying a weapon that could deliver twice the firepower of anything in the German arsenal. They called it Doppeltod, double death. The name spread through German units faster than any official communication could have traveled. It became a legend, a boogeyman, a reason to hesitate before assaulting American positions. Was it real? Was it exaggerated? Nobody knew for certain, and that uncertainty was almost as valuable as the weapon itself. Fear is a weapon too. Marcus Reilly survived the Battle of the Bulge. He carried his double Thompson through the rest of the war, through the liberation of concentration camps, through the final push into Germany, through the collapse of the Third Reich. When the war ended, military intelligence officers wanted to examine his weapon. They'd heard the stories. They wanted to see if the double death was real. Reilly showed them. The officers were impressed and horrified. The weapon was completely unauthorized. It violated every regulation about modifying military equipment. It had never been tested for safety. It could have exploded in Reilly's hands at any moment, but it had also saved lives, possibly dozens of them. The officers faced a choice. They could court-martial Reilly for unauthorized modification of government property, or they could classify the whole thing and pretend it never happened. They chose option 2. Reilly's double Thompson, double, was confiscated. The official records make no mention of it. The men who saw it were discouraged from talking about it. For decades, the Doppeltod existed only in the memories of the soldiers who had witnessed it, American and German alike. The concept of twin-barreled infantry weapons didn't die with Reilly's creation. Throughout military history, engineers have experimented with doubled firearms. The Villar Perosa, an Italian twin-barreled machine pistol from World War I, pioneered the concept. Soviet designers experimented with dual-barrel assault rifles in the Cold War. Modern concepts continue to explore the idea of concentrated firepower, but none of them captured the desperate genius of a field modification made by a soldier who refused to accept limits. Reilly wasn't an engineer. He didn't have a laboratory or testing range. He had a welding torch, scrap metal, and a determination to survive. He looked at the standard equipment and asked, what if it was better? What if I could make it better? And when the Germans came charging through those frozen woods, he had his answer. The military establishment never approved the double Thompson. It was too heavy, too crude, too dangerous. But in the hands of one soldier in one frozen moment, it was exactly what was needed. Sometimes the best weapon is the one that shouldn't exist. Marcus Reilly went home after the war. He returned to Detroit. He worked in factories for another 30 years. He never talked much about what he'd done overseas, but sometimes late at night his wife would find him in the garage working on some mechanical project. Welding, fabricating, turning ordinary things into something more. "What are you making?" she'd ask. "Just fixing something," he'd reply. He never told her about the double Thompson. Never told anyone, really. The official records were classified. The weapon itself was gone. But somewhere in an army warehouse, in a crate marked with faded stencils, 2 Thompson submachine guns sit welded together. A relic of desperation, a monument to improvisation. The weapon the Germans called Double Death. The gun that wasn't supposed to exist. The gun that saved a squad in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. Because sometimes when your back is against the wall, the only answer is more. If this story of battlefield innovation and desperate genius gripped you, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel uncovers the forgotten stories of World War II, the improvised weapons, the impossible stands, and the soldiers who refused to accept limits. Tap the bell so you never miss an upload, and drop a comment below. I want to know, would you have trusted a homemade weapon in combat or stuck with standard issue? Share this video with anyone who appreciates real military history. And check out the video on screen right now for another story of unconventional weapons that changed the war. I'll see you in the next one.